first of all, our department didn't exist, when these samples were being collected back in the 1800s. And I don't think we know even what is the oldest sample that we have in the collection, but certainly we know that there's some from the 1880s and possibly some that are from earlier than that. But it probably started because there were primarily botanists were working with plant diseases. At that particular time, it was primarily within botany, and people were collecting for a variety of reasons. There were important diseases at that time that were that were known, and they were trying to work on them. And that was during a time that there was a lot of botanical collections going on around the world. And in our area, there were people who collected for whatever reason. And on some of them, we don't know even how they got into the collection because those people are gone now. But fortunately, and most of them are from this area. I think there's some from other areas too. And for some reason, they kept them probably in the College of Agriculture because there was no Department of Plant Pathology at that time. And it's important to note that at the turn of the century, there were some very important diseases down in this area, and one of them was rust of wheat, because this was a wheat growing area, a very important part of the United States in the Great Plains, and rust was a huge problem, and so in that collection, I imagine we have some samples that are related to these important diseases at the turn of the century, and of course many other diseases too. So that was one of the reasons that there was a lot of activity going on at that time because of these important diseases. Not only that one, but there were others too. But many of these collections were made by individuals, and then they were, put in boxes and put away, and then just held there, just held for years and years and years. And once in a while, someone would get in there and want to compare something from a modern day to the previous years. But they don't get a lot of use, they're just held. And fortunately, they're held because now with DNA technology, we can go back and look at these, the characteristics of the older populations, which becomes very important in our understanding the genetics of these serious pathogens that we have in our crops and in our horticultural crops too. At that time, people didn't know about DNA, that we didn't understand that we could delve into the genetics of these things so deeply now. So that's one of the extremely valuable things about that collection, that we have preserved, many of these samples from, prior to 1900 and into 1900. So that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind, that now with our new techniques, we can utilize those samples from many years ago to understand better the biology of many of these pathogens. Sometimes we would get a request from another university or another researcher who would ask a question, well, do you have any of these particular samples? And we would have to go in there and try to find out if indeed, we did. But that was fairly rare that somebody would ask that, because among the mycologists and botanists and plant pathologists, there was a lot of sharing of things if we could do that, when somebody needed something, or they wanted to even know if it existed in the area, we might have to look into the collection.
Yeah, so most of the material is primarily used for teaching purposes and educating and public outreach to local area growers, for the dried fungal collection, that's been primarily used for the class that we offer called Fungal Biology. But in terms of the historic collections, like I said, they've been locked up, and as far as I know, they haven't really been used for much of anything. But it would be a great resource if people wanted to do any kind of like genetic studies or try to, revive some of the specimens. I don't know. Yeah, we use it for like fungal biology. We also use it, have used it in like field days for growers, and I know our extension part of our department has utilized some of the dried specimens, but I think they have their own collection that they primarily use. Occasionally we'll get reached out by the biology department whenever they want to like stimulate interest in fungi, primarily the ones everyone's interested in are mushrooms. And I think the most interesting thing is that when I asked about the historic collection, nobody had a key for the cabinet. And so I had to run around and finally got a hold of facilities, which were kind enough to give me an extra key. And when we opened it up, I don't think it had been opened in like decades, because the amount of mothball was overwhelming. But I guess it served its purpose because everything was intact and well preserved.
Well, I mean, when you go through the collection, I haven't been through the collection for many years, but there's a lot of things in there, a lot of different plants and a lot of different fungi. And keeping in mind that one of the problems with older collections is that the names may be different from what we call it today, because the taxonomy and the naming has changed over the years, and even the names of the hosts have changed over the years. So sometimes it's a bit of a detective story to go back and kind of figure out, well, exactly what were they working with at that time, when today we have a different name for it, sometimes a completely different name. So the older collections have to be carefully examined to know exactly what you're working with compared to what we understand the names of these plants and pathogens today. So there's a bit of a detective work that has to go on to do that. But again, I think it's important to note that these samples are rarely used, and that's probably good, because some of these samples are, they're very brittle. They're very old. Some of these are more than 100 years old, and they're brittle, and it's easy to break them up. And sometimes we don't have very much of the sample, and so it's important that we try to minimize the use of them and how much they're actually manipulated. So that's one good thing about having them in a collection, that they don't get used very much. So
well, I think Cornell University, I keep bringing this up to anybody who kind of asks this question. Cornell University has a wonderful, wonderfully curated plant pathology collection. So something that's readily accessible to the general public, where they have a search engine, they can type in either the host, the plant host, or the disease, plant disease itself, and it immediately brings up photos, people, the history, a call number that linked to a dried specimen, and they've got everything organized and maintained. And in general, somebody who's constantly updating people to all the cool new things that we have in the collections.